Today's guest is architect Jose Ricardo Coleman Davis Pagan. Now, Jose Ricardo, or JR as he's known colloquially, is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Now, very, very few architects receive the honor of being a fellow. JR has an interesting heritage which comes from a little bit of everywhere. However, what's the most interesting thing that JR has to share is not where he's come from, but where he wants to be. Let's drop in on the conversation today and listen to JR talk about his life and his heritage and his pride in his family and his homeland.
Well, my mother, Ángeles Pagan Vidal, was born in Caguas, and she's from a very old family from the south coast of Puerto Rico, Ponce, San Germán, from the 17th century. So they're talking about deep history. And, you know, there's quite a things about that family. But my father has a very, very eclectic, I would say, background. My father was born in Mount Vernon, New York, but his father and mother were basically Argentine. My grandfather was born in Chile, in Valparaíso, but they had a very mixed background. My grandmother, who I never met, she was from, there was German immigrants in Esperanza, in Argentina. But my grandfather, his father was born in St. Louis, Missouri. His mother was Australian English. And he was born by chance in Valparaíso, because the family were traveling from Australia to England. The boat stopped in Valparaíso, and it didn't go. It was the end. And so my grandfather was very enterprising. He decided to stay, and the family grew, and they moved to Buenos Aires. He made a fortune and lost it in the Depression. And then the family moved to New York. And that's where my father was born.
Okay, so your heritage sounds entirely European at this point. You've got Germans and English that left Germany and England presumably for economic opportunity, religious opportunity?
Well, my great-grandfather, J.R. Davis, the original one, he was, like I said, he was born in St. Louis. And he had a very, very, very deep background, even going back to Robert Warren that came on the Mayflower, not as a pilgrim, but as a carpenter. Uh-huh. And so they eventually moved west and they settled in St. Louis, the Coleman family, because my real family name is Coleman, not Davis. Davis is an invented name. And the old pirate left St. Louis at 15, went to San Francisco, hopped on a ship that took him to Australia, and that's when that's his whole adventure. But he actually had deep roots in North American culture.
So you're a Mayflower family?
Yes.
Wow. For listeners who might not be Americans who are listening to this, being a Mayflower family in the United States gives you a notable connection to the history of early America. So your family is mobile, and that's on your father's side. And your mother's side is Ponceño, and her heritage is Spanish then? Or?
Yes.
Okay, because she's got a deeply Spanish name.
Yeah, Pagan Vidal, yes.
Right, so, and she in Ponce at the time would have been involved in manufacturing agricultural goods? Or?
It's interesting because my grandmother's family, they had a central, or a sugarcane farm, right? And then on my great-grandfather's side, they were manufacturers of fine millwork. Vidal y Compañía, it's famous that they built these beautiful traditional woodwork. So that side of the family is interesting. That has that creative and manufacturing. That sort of that coincides a little bit with what I do as an architect.
So what you're telling me is you've got a lot of different strands in your ethnic makeup.
Yes.
And that's when you're growing up, you don't realize it because you're just a kid.
Right.
And then you start getting older. And it kind of brings us to the problem that JR and I talked about before we started this speech, was finding his own identity. And why don't you tell us a little bit about when you realized that you weren't quite sure what your identity was?
I went to school in New Orleans, principally because I figured that New Orleans would be similar to the Latin culture. It wasn't too cold. The architecture, I knew through my father, who's an architect. He said, no, the architecture in Louisiana is very similar to the architecture in the countryside of Puerto Rico. So I went to New Orleans, and it was a culture shock, although it was very similar. And interesting, because New Orleans is the people in New Orleans, they look you in the eye. They touch you. They talk about, darling, how's your mama? That's something that's very, maybe Creole, right?
Right.
Not cold like in the north or when I went to England, people were very cold. So I went to New Orleans and everything was fine until I realized that there was a difference, that people would treat me different once they heard me talk Spanish and talk to my Puerto Rican friends and my Latin American friends. He said, wait a minute, you're a little bit different. And I perceived right away that there was a certain distance to that. My grandmother was very influential to our family. She was the center of the family, because my grandfather died when I was 5 years old. So she really was the center, the heart of the three families and the 15 first cousins. Mm-hmm. And she was very proud of being Puerto Rican, mm-hmm. and having a deep history in Puerto Rico. So I had that base. What happened is that I realized, wait a minute, I am Puerto Riqueño.
Yeah.
You know, I have a deep influence of North American, but I am a Puerto Rican. Right. And that made me reject a little bit New Orleans. I wanted to leave New Orleans. I wanted to find something else. So I've always been very conscious of the creative genius of the English. Mm-hmm. Okay? We were talking the beginning of the 70s and the British invasion and actually the architecture that was being done at that time was very exciting to me. So I decided to go I applied to the Architects Association in Bedford Square in London. I got accepted and I left. It was exciting, but I realized that England was not the place. I needed to get back to San Juan. Right. So the quickest way to get back to San Juan and back to what I knew was to go back to Tulane, mm-hmm. finish my 5th year, because architecture is 5 years, and I finished very well. I won the top design prize, and I was driven because I wanted to win that prize.
You're also good at your job, so you've always been a good architect.
I won, and within 3 days of graduating, I was in my father's office working
in San Juan.
In San Juan, and the lucky thing about my father, that he was one of the first architects, modernist architects, that worked in Old San Juan. So the first project I did that I was assigned was a building on a prominent corner on Calle Cristo, corner of San Francisco. Fantastic dream project. It was an art gallery and a residence, and it was a perfect client. Mm-hmm. And it was fantastic because I slipped right where I wanted to slip into. When I came back to San Juan after I graduated, I was, again, in a way, fish out of the water, because I was established here. I had to live here, but I didn't have many friends that were Puerto Riqueños, no? Until I met my wife. And I realized that that's exactly what I needed. My wife is a poet, writer, very articulate, very exciting, very generous. And she filled that void that I needed. And it sort of made a complete circle with my grandmother's family, with my mother's family. And I moved to San Juan. I lived in the old city. I restored a house on Calle San Sebastián. That's still in my family, that my sons have lived afterwards. So Elsa really was what gave me those roots that were still waiting to get to the ground.
Well, you know, for the listener, JR's eyes just absolutely lit up when he said my wife. So they've had a long relationship. You've been married for quite a while now.
We've been married, I think, 44 years.
44 years and 3 sons.
3 sons.
3 sons.
And they all live in Puerto Rico, except Enrique, that's living in New York part-time.
Now, when you talk about Elsa, her family has deep Puerto Rican heritage.
Yes. And you talk about a cultural affirmation. That is the epitome. The family is the epitome of that. On both sides, of the mother and the father. All writers, poets, and persons who have exteriorized their feelings. You know, they write it, they speak it, they pronounce it. No? Right. And so I've been part of that for the last 50 years almost. No? And my father-in-law was a writer, a very prolific writer, and he was a big influence on me.
Isn't he the man who coined the term Spanglish?
Yes, Salvador Tío. Spanglish, yes.
Spanglish, that was his word,
right.
Which has obviously become such a word that it exists in many languages now. For the listener, if you aren't a Spanish speaker, the Spanish that the Puerto Ricans speak is Spanish, but it's highly inflected by English and it's highly inflected by local neologisms. And so it is quite possible that a Spanish speaker from Madrid could enter a house in San Juan and not understand much. And it's a little bit like Cockney English or some of the English you might find in the Cajun lands of the south of the United States. It's a little bit of a Creolic recipe. And your father-in-law is the man who wanted to start to try and tame the beast, right?
But he identified it. He didn't support it. And he was president of the Real Academia de la Lengua Española, which means, you know, it's the Academy of the Language, and to speak correctly and write correctly. So you have that, you know, he discovered that locally people would mince up their words and incorporate a lot of English words, Anglicisms, no? But he was adamant about talking the correct language.
So you grew up speaking English, you were educated in English. I assume that all of your children were educated in Spanish.
Yes, they in Spanish, yes, but they also went to a Jesuit school, and they had a very strong Spanish base.
And one of your sons went to the university in Connecticut, went to Yale for law school, and
an undergraduate, he went to Harvard.
So obviously their English is well enough to get them into the best English-speaking institutions in the United States, if not in the world. So you really are threading the needle with a lot of different strands of identity here. And as we speak of this, I realize that your background is even richer than I had expected when I invited you here, and I expected it was going to be notable when we started chatting. But, you know, so you've got all these leaves on your tree, but your roots are here now, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and being an architect, it gives me, I mean, it's imperative that my architecture reflect my identity. I mean, maybe some architects are not conscious of that, but I am very conscious of that. And we say, and I feel like I'm doing, I wouldn't say Puerto Rican architecture, but architecture for Puerto Rico. And that becomes Puerto Rican architecture. Puerto Rico is part of the tropics, right? The Caribbean.
Right.
And there are patterns, there are conditions that are particular to our latitude and our longitude, no? So where the sun is, how it rains, the heat, the breezes, that is something that is in our DNA, right? And you have to respond to that. And you have to, and the only way is to be conscious of it, not just pass by it. You have to make sure you know where the wind comes from, where the sun moves, what happens the sun in the wintertime or in the summertime. And if you adapt to that, you already started. And then nowadays we're very conscious of sustainability. So what is more sustainable than to keep it simple and to not heat up the walls, don't heat up the roofs, plant trees in certain strategic places, and then again and respond to the breeze.
Well, I will ask you the question that I've been asking every single person I've interviewed, which is, how has understanding your identity or solving the problem of your identity helped you understand yourself today at this moment?
I think I know what I want. I'm pretty sure of where I'm going now that I've already, 71 years old. And I want to continue as long as I can to keep doing, and with the knowledge I've gained through so many years, is to make it even better. And that I feel that I'm instilling in my son, Enrique, the way my father, to a certain extent, gave it to me, although I only worked with him 5 years. But I instill it in my son and my sons, because we all live in basically the same place. My son, Jose, who could have been a high-powered lawyer in New York City, and actually he was offered a partnership in a very important firm there, but he decided he wanted to live in Puerto Rico, and he wanted his children to grow up where he grew up. So I think that it's important to continue that vein, and we're in a perfect position for that.
An optimistic sense of place.
Yes.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm so glad to hear you say that. And if you could send any message to any of your grandchildren or great-grandchildren you might not meet, at least not on this side, what would you tell them?
I would say that somebody talks about their grandfather or their great-grandfather, or that he was somebody that was committed. He was committed to our country and to making a better place. That's really, as architects, we are committed to making life better for occupants of our buildings and around our buildings. If I can prove that I did that, I'm happy, and that they would be proud of that.
Well, JR, thank you for the conversation today, and I love to hear you shine.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me in that deeply personal and intimate conversation where JR, Jose Ricardo Coleman Davis, describes how he finally found his family and discovered his roots. Before we wrap up here, I'd like to share with you something special, which is the design brief that I've written over the conversation that you've just heard. You see, my jewelry starts not with raw materials. It doesn't start at a jeweler's bench. The conception of my jewelry is always in a conversation with another person, and from those conversations, I'm able to distill design briefs. Now, the design brief that I wrote for JR is called Rooted in Transience, a reflection on identity and the search for belonging. You can read or listen to me read the full brief along with the finished piece and renderings for JR's conversation on my website at theintrepidwendell.com/shine. I'm really looking forward to our next episode, where I travel to Italy and have a conversation with Elizabeth Weingraber-Pircher, and she describes her desire to break through cultural boundaries and unite the world under blankets of common understanding. That conversation is really beautifully moving as Elizabeth describes her desire to get people to see what they have in common with each other rather than what keeps them separate. I look forward to seeing you there. Last but not least, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with someone who might like to hear JR's story. You can go visit our website for more behind-the-scenes content. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing a part of your time with me. My name is Daniel Boettcher, and I love to hear you shine.